Good evening. Or perhaps it is not evening at all where you are. Perhaps it is the small gray hour after midnight, when the house has finally gone quiet and the world outside the window has stopped asking anything of you. Perhaps it is the middle of an ordinary afternoon and you have simply decided that, for a little while, you would like to think about something very old and very large. It does not matter. Wherever you are, however you came to be here, you are welcome. Tonight, we are going to tell a story. It is a long story, and we are in no hurry to finish it. You do not need to follow every turn. You do not need to remember anything at all. If your eyes are already heavy, let them close. If your thoughts begin to drift away from these words, out toward the soft edges of sleep, then let them drift. The story will go on without you, patiently, and it will still be here if you return. Nothing in the next several hours requires your effort. You may simply rest and listen, and let the voices of long-dead philosophers move through the dark like a slow and gentle tide. The story we are going to tell is the story of a single word, a small word in English, only 4 letters: will. You use it without thinking. You say, "I will go tomorrow," and you have placed yourself in the future. You say, "I have no will left," when the day has emptied you out. You speak of a strong-willed child, of a last will and testament, of willpower, of doing something against your will. The word is everywhere, worn smooth by use, like a stone carried a long way in a pocket. And like such a stone, you have almost stopped feeling its shape. But underneath that ordinary little word lies one of the strangest and deepest questions a human being has ever asked. What is it exactly that wants? What is this thing in you that reaches out toward the world, that desires, refuses, chooses, strives, and will not be still? Is it the truest part of you, the very core of who you are? Or is it a kind of stranger living inside you, a blind and restless force that uses you for its own purposes and cares nothing for your peace? For a long stretch of human thought, the stretch we are going to walk through tonight, this question pressed itself upon some of the most serious minds who ever lived, and they did not agree. One of them, a quiet and orderly man in a cold northern town, would say that the will, rightly understood, is the only thing in all the world that is good without qualification, the very dignity of a human being. Another, a brilliant and bitter man who slept with a loaded pistol by his bed, would say that the will is the secret engine of the entire universe, a hungry and meaningless striving that drives the stars and the seas and your own beating heart, and that it is the source of all suffering, and that the highest wisdom is to learn, somehow, to want nothing at all. And a third, a sickly and lonely man riding in mountain villages, would take that despair and turn it inside out, and declare that the will to grow, to overcome, to become more than you are, is not a curse to be escaped, but the deepest yes that life can say to itself. 3 men, 3 answers, 1 word. We will sit with each of them in turn. We will visit the cold rooms where they wrote and follow the slow unfolding of their thoughts, and we will see how each one took the great idea handed to him by the one before and broke it open and made of it something new. But we will not begin with any of them, because before we can ask what the will is, we have to notice something rather astonishing, something easy to miss, lying right at the foundation of everything. The will, as we now think of it, this inner faculty of wanting and choosing that feels so obviously, permanently human, this idea has a history. It was, in a sense, invented. There were brilliant, thoughtful people long ago who looked into the human soul as carefully as anyone ever has, and who did not find a will there at all. They had no such word. They did not feel the need for one. So that is where our long night begins. Not in the modern world with its anxious talk of willpower and self-control, but far back in the bright air of an ancient afternoon, in a city by the sea, with a barefoot old man asking impossible questions in the marketplace. Settle in. Make yourself comfortable. There is no hurry at all. Let us begin. Imagine for a moment that we could travel backward through time, the way one walks slowly down a long hallway, letting the centuries fall away behind us. The cities of the modern world go dark, one by one. The hum of electricity fades. The libraries empty of their books, then empty even of paper. Empires rise in reverse and sink back into the soil, and the air grows clearer and warmer, until at last we are standing in the white sunlight of Athens, some 400 years before the birth of Christ, a small city of stone and olive trees, loud with argument, where men gather in the open marketplace to talk all day about how a person ought to live. And here is a man you may have heard of. He is old and ugly and poor, and he goes about barefoot. He claims to know nothing, and he spends his days asking other people questions until the things they were sure of fall to pieces in their hands. His name is Socrates. Now, Socrates believed something that will sound to your modern ears almost impossible. He believed that no one ever does wrong on purpose. Sit with how strange that is. Socrates thought that if a person truly, fully understood what was good, really grasped it all the way down, they would do it automatically, without struggle. To know the good was to do the good. And so all wrongdoing, every cruelty and cowardice and betrayal in the whole human story was, for Socrates, at bottom, a kind of mistake, a failure of knowledge. People do wrong because they are confused about what is truly good for them. They reach for pleasure or money or safety, thinking it will make them happy, and they are simply wrong, the way a person can be wrong about a sum. Fix the error, show them clearly, and the wrongdoing dissolves. You can feel immediately how this clashes with your own experience, because you know everyone knows the other thing. You know what it is to see clearly what you ought to do, and to want, in some part of yourself, to do it, and then to do the opposite anyway. To know that the second glass of wine, the cruel reply, the broken promise, is wrong, to know it perfectly well in the very moment, and to choose it regardless. The Greeks had a word for this, akrasia. We might translate it as weakness of will, the condition of being defeated by yourself. But here is the remarkable thing. For Socrates, there is no such condition. Properly speaking, it cannot happen. If you do the wrong thing, then in that moment you did not truly know it was wrong. Your knowledge was not real knowledge, but only a kind of opinion, thin and unsteady, that the pull of the moment overcame. There is no inner traitor, no separate faculty that knows the good and refuses it. There is only the mind, seeing clearly or seeing dimly. His great pupil Plato, and then Plato's great pupil Aristotle, would soften this and complicate it. Aristotle, a far more practical man, looked honestly at the weak-willed person and admitted, yes, this really happens. The appetites really do drag us against our better judgment. He gave us rich words, deliberate choice, the voluntary and the involuntary, the slow training of habit into character. He understood desire and spirited anger and reasoned wish and how they pull in different directions inside us. And yet, and this is the quiet thing that scholars of these matters have noticed, and that I want to leave gently in your mind tonight, in all of this vast and subtle Greek thinking about the soul, there is no clear place for the will, not as we mean it, not as a distinct power standing between knowing and doing, a power that can survey what reason commands and what desire craves, and then, sovereign over both, simply decide. The Greeks gave us reason and appetite and spirit and choice. But this particular thing, this engine of the self that can know the good with perfect clarity and still freely turn away from it, this they did not name. Some who have studied the ancient world long and carefully have come to believe that the Greeks did not name it because they did not have it, that the will, as an idea, simply had not yet been born. So where does it come from? When does this strange new piece of furniture appear in the house of the human soul? To find it, we have to leave the bright marketplace of Athens behind and the cool confidence of the philosophers in the sun. We have to turn toward a very different kind of voice, not a man explaining the world calmly to his students, but a man crying out in a letter from the middle of an inner storm. The voice belongs to a traveling preacher named Paul, writing in the 1st century to a community in Rome. And in one of those letters, he says something that no Greek philosopher had quite said in that way before. He confesses, with a kind of anguish, that he does not understand his own actions, for he does not do the good that he wants to do, and the very evil he does not want. That is the thing he finds himself doing. There is something in him, he says, at war with the deepest wishes of his heart, dragging him where he does not want to go. Listen to what is happening there. It is no longer a question of knowledge, of seeing clearly or dimly. Paul sees perfectly well. He wants the good. The trouble is precisely that wanting it is not enough, that the self has split into pieces, and one piece wills what another piece will not perform. This is not the Socratic mistake. This is something newer and darker and far more familiar to most of us. A divided self, a house divided against itself. The seed was planted. And it would take a few more centuries and one of the most restless minds in all of human history to grow it into a full idea. His name was Augustine. He was born in North Africa in the 4th century, when the Roman world was beginning to crack and crumble. As a young man, he was brilliant, ambitious, and by his own anguished account, a slave to his own desires. He wanted to be good. He also, very much, did not want to be good yet. And there is a line he later wrote about those years that has echoed down 16 centuries because it is so painfully honest. He confessed that he used to pray for purity and self-control, and to add, under his breath, but not yet. He could see the better life. He could even sincerely want it, and he could not make himself cross over into it. And so Augustine did something that, in a way, no one had done before with such depth. He turned his gaze inward and stared directly at that gap, the gap between wanting and doing, between the command and the obedience, and he asked, "What is happening here?" And he noticed something that still has the power to stop you in your tracks if you really attend to it. He noticed that when the mind commands the body, lift your hand, take a step, the body simply obeys, instantly, so smoothly that command and obedience are almost the same motion. But when the mind commands itself, when the self tells the self, will this, choose this, become this, it is not obeyed. The very thing giving the command and the very thing refusing it are one and the same. There are not two people inside you, and yet there seem to be two wills, and neither of them whole, each one partial, each one strong enough to resist the other, but not strong enough to win cleanly. The self cannot simply command itself, the way it commands a hand to rise. Out of this astonished, agonized self-examination, Augustine gave the Western mind a new word for a new thing. In Latin, voluntas, the will, a faculty all its own, not reason, not desire, not appetite, but the very power of the self to turn toward or away, to consent or refuse, to say yes or no in the secret center of a person. And he made it the stage on which the whole drama of a human life is played out, the place where we are free, the place where we fall, the place where we are lost, and the only place where we might be saved. One thinker of our own time called Augustine, for this reason, the first philosopher of the will, the one in whom this strange faculty first stepped fully into the light and took its place at the heart of what a person is. And once the will had been named, once it stood there in the middle of the soul, an enormous question opened up behind it, a question that would occupy the next 1,000 years, and that, in a sense, has never closed. Who is in charge? Is the will the servant of reason, a faithful follower that simply carries out whatever the intellect, looking on the world, judges to be good? Or is the will the master, free, sovereign, able even to turn its back on what reason calls good, choosing for no reason at all except that it chooses? The great cathedral minds of the Middle Ages took up both sides. There were those, and Thomas Aquinas was their calm and towering voice, who held that the will follows the light of the intellect. We will a thing because we first see it, however dimly, as good. The mind shows the way, and the will walks it, freely, but in step. Reason leads. And there were others, sharper, stranger, more unsettling, who said no. Among them a subtle Scotsman, John Duns Scotus, and after him an English friar, William of Ockham. For them, the will was king. It was the highest power in the soul, free in a way that nothing could finally constrain, able to choose against the verdict of reason, to turn from the very thing presented to it as best, simply by its own sovereign act. And they extended this all the way up to the foundations of reality itself. If the will is supreme in us, then it is supreme above all in God, whose sheer, free, unfathomable willing is what lays down the order of the world, so that a thing is not good first and then willed. Rather, it is willed and therefore good. They were called the voluntarists, from that same Latin word, voluntas. And though they were arguing about the soul and about God, and though the modern world would mostly forget the details of their debates, they had let something loose into Western thought that would not be caught again. A suspicion, a possibility. The idea that, at the very bottom of things, beneath all the order and all the reasons, what we might finally find is not a thought, not a law, not a luminous idea, but a will, a naked act of wanting, holding up the whole of reality from underneath. Hold that thought gently. Do not grip it. Just let it rest somewhere in the back of your mind, like a coal kept warm under ash. Because in a few hundred years, a Prussian philosopher will lift the will to the very summit of human dignity, and then, almost immediately after him, another man will reach behind the entire visible world and announce that the voluntarists were right all along, that the thing in itself, the bedrock of everything that is, has a single, terrible name, and that name is will. The centuries turn. The Middle Ages give way to the modern age. Descartes, sitting alone by his fire, will declare that of all the powers of the soul, the will is the one most like the infinite, boundless, unconfined, the very image in us of God's freedom, and also, for that same reason, the source of all our errors, because the will is forever reaching out beyond the little that the understanding clearly sees. The free will becomes the great battlefield of modern philosophy. Are we free, or are we wound up like clocks and only dreaming that we choose? And into the middle of that battlefield, in a cold and orderly town on the far edge of the German lands, a town so regular in its habits that, the story goes, the neighbors set their clocks by his afternoon walk, there came a small, precise, endlessly patient man who would gather up the whole inheritance of the will and try to show, with the most careful argument anyone had ever attempted, that a free will and the moral law are, in the end, one and the same thing, and that this, and this alone, is the source of the dignity of every human being who has ever lived. His name was Immanuel Kant, and that is where we will go. But not yet. Rest now. Let the old questions settle around you in the dark. The marketplace of Athens, the divided heart of Augustine, the sovereign will of the medieval friars, holding up the world from underneath. There is nothing you need to do with any of it. We have a long way still to travel, and all the time in the world. Breathe slowly. We will go on in a moment. We come now to the cold north, to the far edge of the German-speaking world, to a city called Kingsburg, a city of merchants and soldiers and gray skies, hard against the Baltic Sea, where the winters are long and the light, for much of the year, is thin. It is the kind of town a great mind might be expected to flee. And yet, the man we have come to meet was born here, and lived here, and died here, and in all his long life he scarcely traveled beyond its walls. He did not need to. He found everything he was looking for inside the small compass of his own study, and the still smaller compass of his own mind. His days were famously, almost comically regular. He rose at the same hour, he drank his tea and smoked a single pipe and wrote through the morning. He lectured, he took his lunch, and here he allowed himself one indulgence, for he loved good company and good conversation at the table, and kept his guests laughing long into the afternoon. And then, every day, at precisely the same moment, he put on his gray coat, took up his cane, and walked the same route through the town, so punctually, the old story says, that his neighbors set their clocks by the sight of him passing. The same streets, the same hour, year after year after year. And here is the gentle paradox I want you to hold as you drift tonight. That out of this life of perfect, unbroken, almost unbearable regularity, a life in which, on the surface, nothing happened, there came one of the most violent revolutions in the entire history of human thought. The quietest of men set off an earthquake. He himself called it a kind of Copernican revolution, and the name was not too grand. For most of human history, people had assumed something that seems only natural, that when we come to know the world, our minds are like mirrors, passively reflecting things as they truly are out there. The world is given, the mind receives it. Kant turned this exactly around. What if, he asked, it is not our minds that conform to the world, but the world as we experience it that conforms to our minds? Think of it this way, slowly. You have never once in your entire life experienced anything that did not arrive already arranged in space, and already strung along in time, and already bound up in chains of cause and effect. Every sight, every sound, every thought you have ever had came to you wearing those three garments: space, time, and causality. And Kant's astonishing suggestion was that these are not features of the world as it is in itself, out there, independent of you. They are the structure of your own mind, the lenses you cannot take off, the shape your experience must take in order to be experience at all. Space and time are not things you find. They are the very forms through which any finding can happen. They belong to the seeing, not to the seen. And if that is true, then a strange and vertiginous conclusion follows. It means you never encounter the world as it truly is, in itself. You encounter only the world as it appears already filtered, already shaped, already wearing the spectacles you can never remove. Kant gave these two sides their names. The world as it appears to us, structured by our minds, he called the realm of appearances, the phenomena, and the world as it is in itself, behind all appearing, untouched by our lenses, he called the thing in itself, the noumenon. And then he did something that would haunt everything that came after. He drew a veil between the two and declared it could never be lifted. The thing in itself is real. It must be there, behind the appearances, for there to be appearances of anything. But it is, in principle, forever unknowable. Our minds are built to know appearances and nothing else. Reach behind the veil, and your concepts go dead in your hands. Reason, straining past its limit, falls into contradiction. There is a door at the bottom of reality, Kant said. There is certainly something on the far side of it, but it is locked, and we do not have the key, and we were never meant to. Hold that locked door in your mind. We will come back to it. A great deal of our story turns on it. Now, you might think that a philosophy like this, a philosophy that fences us off from reality itself, that shuts us inside the little theater of our own appearances, would end in gloom. But for Kant, the opposite was true, because the very same veil that hid the world from us also, he came to believe, made room for something. It made room for freedom, and it is here at last that the will steps onto the stage.
Consider the problem. In the world of appearances, the only world science can study, the world of moving bodies and firing nerves and falling stones, everything is caused by something before it, in an unbroken chain, with no gaps anywhere. Every event is the necessary result of the events that came before, and you are, in that world, a body among bodies, an object among objects. So when you raise your hand, or make a choice, or fall in love, or commit a crime, if all of that is just one more link in the great causal chain, fully determined by everything that came before, by your upbringing and your chemistry and the motion of atoms, then in what sense are you free? In what sense did you choose it all? You seem to be a clockwork thing that merely dreams it is choosing. This is one of the oldest aches in all of philosophy, and Kant felt it as keenly as anyone ever has. And his way out ran straight through that locked door. Yes, he said, as an appearance, as a body in the world of phenomena, you are entirely determined. Every one of your actions, viewed from the outside, falls under the iron law of cause and effect, and the scientist is right to study you that way. But that is not all you are. For you are not only an appearance. Like everything else, you also have a side that belongs to the thing in itself, a self behind the veil, a self that does not live in time, that is not a link in any chain. And there, in that hidden noumenal depth that we can never observe and never prove, there you may truly be free. Not free in spite of the law, but free with a freedom that the world of appearances has no power to touch, because it lies on the far side of the only door science can never open. So notice where Kant has placed the real self, the free self, the choosing self. He has placed it behind the veil. The will, in its freedom, belongs to the noumenon, the thing in itself, the unknowable depth of the world. Remember that. It will matter enormously very soon. But Kant was not content to leave freedom as a mere possibility, a maybe, a thing we cannot rule out. He wanted to show that we have positive reason to believe in it, And he found that reason not in science, not in looking outward at the stars and the stones, but in something each of us carries within, the strange, undeniable experience of moral obligation, the sense that there are things we ought to do and ought not to do, not because of what will happen to us, not because of reward or punishment, but simply because they are right or wrong. And Kant's great move was this: you could not feel that you ought to do a thing unless, at some level, you could do it. The ought implies the can. The moral law speaks to you as a free being, and the very fact that it speaks at all is the proof, the only proof we shall ever have, that free you must be. We know we are free, Kant says, because we know we are bound by duty. And this brings us at last to the sentence with which he opened his little book on morality. The groundwork, he called it, the groundwork for a metaphysics of morals, one of the most famous opening lines in all of philosophy, and one of the most extraordinary. He wrote that there is nothing, anywhere in the world, or even beyond it, that can be called good without qualification, good in itself, good with no strings attached, except a good will. Let that settle, because it is a stranger claim than it first sounds. Think of everything we usually call good: intelligence, a marvelous thing; courage, wit, determination, self-control, wealth, health, power, even happiness itself. Kant says, every single one of these can be turned to evil. The clever mind makes the more dangerous criminal. The courage of the villain makes him worse, not better. The cool self-control of the cruel man only makes his cruelty more terrible. Even happiness, Kant says, there is something in us that cannot bear the sight of a thoroughly wicked person enjoying unbroken good fortune. Not one of these things is good in itself. Each is good only when it is taken up and used by a will that is itself good. And so the good will alone is good without any condition at all. And this is the part that has moved people for 2 centuries. It is good not because of what it achieves. A good will does not become good by succeeding, by producing happy results in the world. Even if through sheer bad luck it should accomplish nothing whatsoever, even if a person of perfectly good will were robbed by fate of every power to act, and lay helpless and could change nothing, that will would still, Kant says, shine like a jewel, by its own inner light, having its whole worth in itself. The goodness is in the willing, not in the outcome, in the willing. But what is a will for Kant? Here he gives it a definition that ties together everything we have been circling all night. A will, he says, is the power to act not merely according to laws. Every stone and planet does that, but according to the idea of laws, according to principles. To act because you have grasped a rule and made it your own. And this, he says, is something only a rational being can do. So that, for Kant, the will and reason, practical reason, reason in action, are very nearly the same thing. To have a will is to be able to govern yourself by reasons. The will is reason doing. And how should such a will govern itself? Kant's answer is the idea he is most famous for, the categorical imperative. The phrase sounds forbidding, but the thought beneath it is almost simple. Most of the rules we live by are what he called hypothetical. They are conditional. They hang on an if. If you want to be healthy, exercise. If you want people to trust you, keep your promises. These rules bind you only as long as you happen to want the thing they aim at. Let go of the goal, and the rule lets go of you. But the moral law, Kant insisted, is not like that. It does not say if. It does not bargain. It commands categorically, unconditionally, do this, full stop, whether or not it serves any desire of yours, whether or not it makes you happy.
simply because it is right. And the test he gave for it is one you may have met before, though perhaps not knowing whose it was. Before you act, look at the principle behind your action, the rule you would be living by, and then ask, could I will that everyone, everywhere, always lived by this same rule? Could this become a universal law, with no exceptions, not even for me? If you find that you cannot, if the rule only works as long as you are the special case who gets to break it while everyone else keeps it, then you have caught yourself in a kind of quiet contradiction, and the action is forbidden. Lie when it suits you, but only because you trust that others tell the truth. Break your promise, but only because promises are generally kept. The cheat depends on a world of honest people. He wills a law he cannot bear to see made universal. He makes himself, secretly, an exception. And to be moral, for Kant, is precisely to refuse that, to act only on principles you could hold up to the whole human race and say, yes, everyone, including me. He gave the same law a second face, even more beautiful, and perhaps the one that has lasted longest in the human heart. Always treat humanity, whether in yourself or in any other person, never merely as a means to your ends, but always at the same time as an end. Never use a person as a mere tool, a mere instrument, a thing to be spent for your purposes and discarded. Every rational being carries within an absolute worth, an end in themselves, never to be reduced to your convenience. And here, Kant drew a distinction that I would like to leave with you softly as you rest. He said that things in the world have a price, and whatever has a price can be exchanged for something else of equal value, traded, substituted, replaced. But a person, he said, does not have a price. A person has something else, something for which there is no equivalent and no exchange. A person has dignity. And what gives a person that dignity, that priceless, unexchangeable worth, is precisely this, that they possess a will that can give itself the moral law. And so we arrive at the summit of the whole long climb, the single idea at the very heart of Kant's vision of the will, and the reason he belongs at the center of our story. The word is autonomy. It comes from two Greek words, autos meaning self, and nomos meaning law. Self-law, self-government. And here is what Kant meant by it, and why it changed everything. We usually imagine that freedom means doing whatever you want, following your desires wherever they lead, with nothing to stop you. But Kant saw, with great clarity, that this is not freedom at all. It is the opposite. The person who simply chases each desire as it arises, who is pushed this way by hunger, and that way by fear, and the other way by vanity, that person is not free. They are driven. They are a leaf in the wind of their own appetites, ruled by forces they did not choose and cannot command. Kant called that condition heteronomy, being given your law by something other than yourself, by your desires, by nature, by the threats and bribes of the world, by the commands of another. The slave obeys a master outside himself. But so, Kant says, does the man who can do nothing but obey his own cravings. Both are ruled from outside the self.
True freedom, autonomy, is something far rarer and far higher. It is the will giving the law to itself. It is the self that does not merely follow its impulses, but rises above them and asks what it ought to do, and binds itself to the answer, not because anyone is watching, not because of reward or punishment, but freely, by its own act, out of respect for a law it has itself authored. The free will is not a lawless will, flailing in every direction. The free will is a self-governing will, obedient to a law, but to a law it gives itself. That is the deep secret Kant believed he had uncovered, that freedom and law, which seem like enemies, are in truth the same thing seen from two sides. A free will and a will under the moral law are one and the same. To be truly free is to be the author of the law you obey. And if that is so, then every rational being, every single person who has ever lived, however humble, however overlooked, is something almost beyond imagining. Each is a lawgiver. Each carries within an absolute and unrepeatable dignity as a member of what Kant called the kingdom of ends, that ideal community in which every person is at once subject to the moral law and its co-author, ruled and ruler together, each one bowing to the law precisely because each one helped to write it. This, for Kant, was the true meaning hidden inside that small, worn, everyday word. The will is not merely the engine of our wanting. Rightly understood, it is the seat of our freedom, the ground of our dignity, the one thing in all the universe that is good without condition, the place where a human being touches something higher than the whole machinery of cause and effect, and stands for a moment as a free and self-commanding soul. Near the very end of his life, Kant wrote a sentence that they later carved upon his tomb. He said that two things filled him with an ever-deepening awe, the more steadily he considered them: the starry heavens above him, and the moral law within him. The one, the vast cold cosmos, reminding him how small he was, a speck of dust on a speck of dust, lost in an immensity of stars. And the other, the moral law, the free and self-commanding will in his own breast, lifting him back up and reminding him that this small speck of dust carried within it something the whole starry heaven did not possess: a freedom, a dignity, a worth beyond all price. That is the gift Kant tried to give us. The will enthroned, the will made holy. And yet, remember the locked door. Remember where Kant was forced to place that free and shining self. Not here, in the visible world, but behind the veil, in the thing in itself, in the noumenal depth that he swore, with all his rigor, we could never, ever know. Kant had told us that the real self, the free moral will, lives on the far side of that door. And then he had bolted the door and stood before it and said, "Here we must stop. Of the thing in itself, nothing can be known. Reason must fall silent at the threshold. We can believe, we cannot see." It was a magnificent restraint. It was also, for the man who came after him, an unbearable temptation, because not long after Kant laid down his pen, there came another philosopher, younger, prouder, fiercer, with none of Kant's patience and all of his ambition, who walked up to that locked door and announced to a world that thought it sealed forever that he had found the key, that he knew what lay on the other side, that he could tell us, at last, the true name of the thing in itself, the secret inner nature of the whole world, of the stars and the seas, and your own restless heart. And it was not the serene, rational, law-giving will that Kant had so lovingly placed there. It was something else, something blind, something that wanted and wanted and wanted, and would never, for one moment, be satisfied. His name was Arthur Schopenhauer, and the door he opened does not close again. But not yet. Rest now. We have climbed a long way tonight, all the way to the summit of the moral will, to the starry heavens and the law within. Stay here a while, in the high, cold air, where the will is the most dignified thing in all creation. Hold it gently, because when we go on, we will begin, very slowly, to climb back down into the dark beneath the world, where a different philosopher is waiting to show us what he believes is really there. There is no hurry at all. Breathe slowly. We will go on in a moment. So now we begin to climb back down. Down from the high, cold summit where Kant left us, with the starry heavens above and the moral law within. Down past the locked door at the bottom of the world. And we go down in the company of a man who could hardly have been more different from the serene old bachelor of Kingsburg. A man as restless and bitter as Kant was orderly and calm. A man who carried a wound in him all his life and never let it close. His name was Arthur Schopenhauer, and he was born in the year 1788 in the old Baltic trading city of Danzig, into a family of wealthy merchants. And from the very beginning, his life was shadowed. His father, a proud and successful man of business, intended Arthur to follow him into trade, and the boy dutifully tried. But when Arthur was just 17, his father was found dead in the water of a canal beside the family warehouse, almost certainly by his own hand. The shadow of that death, and of the melancholy his father had passed down to him in the blood, never left Arthur Schopenhauer. He believed all his life that a person's fundamental character, their cheerfulness or their gloom, their kindness or their cruelty, was fixed from birth, unchosen and unchangeable, written into them before they ever drew breath. He had reason to believe it. He saw it in his own mirror. His mother was another matter entirely. Johanna Schopenhauer was a clever, charming, sociable woman who, after her husband's death, moved to the city of Weimar and became a celebrated novelist and the hostess of a glittering literary salon, a salon graced, from time to time, by the greatest German of the age, the poet Goethe himself. And between this bright, worldly, gregarious mother and her dark, brooding, quarrelsome son, there was almost nothing but friction. They wounded each other again and again, until at last there came a final, terrible rupture. A quarrel on a staircase, the story goes, after which mother and son never spoke again, nor saw each other for the more than 20 years that remained of her life. He had, it seems, a genius for solitude, but his father had left him one priceless thing: money. Enough money that Arthur Schopenhauer never had to earn his bread. He could devote his entire existence to thinking and writing, beholden to no patron, no university, no church, no public taste. He could say exactly what he believed, and he did, and the freedom shows on every page he ever wrote. He was not, I should tell you, an easy man to love. He was vain and suspicious and quick to take offense. He kept a loaded pistol by his bed and would not let a barber's razor near his throat. He distrusted nearly everyone. His one steady companion for most of his life was a series of poodles, and he gave them all the same name, Atman, a word from the sacred books of India, meaning the world soul, the deepest self of all things. He dined alone, at the same table in the same inn, and he is said to have placed a gold coin on the tablecloth before each meal, vowing to give it to the poor the day he overheard the young army officers at the next table speak of anything higher than horses, women, and dogs, and to have pocketed the coin again, in contempt, at the end of every single meal for years. And for most of his life, the world ignored him completely. He wrote his masterpiece young, astonishingly young, and published it, and it sank without a trace. Almost no one bought it. Almost no one read it. He took a post lecturing at the University of Berlin, and in his towering pride, he deliberately scheduled his lectures at the very same hour as those of the most famous philosopher in all of Germany, a man named Hegel, then at the absolute height of his fame, whom Schopenhauer despised with a pure and inexhaustible hatred, calling him a charlatan and a clumsy windbag who had corrupted a whole generation. Hegel's hall was packed to the walls. Schopenhauer's stood nearly empty. He gave up lecturing in humiliation, and the wound of it festered for decades. He had to wait until he was an old man, until the 1850s, near the very end, for fame to arrive at last, almost by accident, through a little book of essays and biting aphorisms that suddenly caught the public's mood. And then, for the final decade of his life, he was celebrated, sought out, photographed, visited by admirers, the recognition he had craved for 40 years, arriving just in time for him to enjoy it with a bitter, satisfied smile. He died in his armchair in Frankfurt in 1860, an old man who had finally been proven, to his own complete satisfaction, right. I tell you all of this, the gloom, the solitude, the bitterness, not to gossip, but because it presses so strangely against the contents of his thought. For this difficult, unhappy, misanthropic man wrote one of the most profound and, in the end, one of the most strangely compassionate philosophies ever conceived. And in his study, all his life, he kept two images before him. On one side, a bust of Kant, the master he revered above all others, and on the other, a gilded statue of the Buddha. And between those two figures, the cool philosopher of the will's dignity and the serene teacher of the will's extinction, the whole of Schopenhauer's vision is suspended. That vision he had, he said, as a single thought, one thought which he spent his whole life turning over and elaborating, but never essentially changing. He poured it into one great book, written before he was 30, with a title that names its two halves like the two sides of a single coin, The World as Will and Representation. The world, Schopenhauer says, has two faces. The first face is the one we all know, the world as it appears, the world spread out before us. And he opens his book with a sentence as bold and strange as Kant's, a sentence meant to stop you where you stand. He says, "The world is my representation, my presentation. Everything you have ever seen or touched or heard, the room around you, the sky, your own hands, the stars, all of it exists, as you know it, only as an appearance to you, a presentation arising in your consciousness, shaped through and through by your own mind. This is Kant's veil, taken up and made total. The sun and the earth are not simply there in themselves. There is an eye that sees the sun, a hand that feels the earth, and apart from that seeing and feeling, the world as we know it is nothing. The whole vast glittering theater of things in space and time is representation, appearance, and behind it, as Kant taught, lies the thing in itself, hidden. And what scatters the one world into its endless multitude of separate things, this tree and that tree, you over here and I over there, a million distinct beings, each walled off inside its own skin, is, Schopenhauer says, simply space and time. Space and time are the great principle of separation, the principle of individuation, the loom on which the one is woven into the many. And here he reaches back, past Kant, all the way to the ancient sages of India, and borrows their image. This world of separate things, he says, is the veil of Maya, the shimmering veil of illusion, the dream curtain of multiplicity drawn across a deeper unity, making us believe in 1,000 things where, underneath, there is only one. So that is the first face, the world as representation, as appearance, as the dream we are all dreaming. But Schopenhauer was not content, as Kant had been, to stop at the veil and declare the thing in itself forever unknowable. He believed Kant had given up too soon, that there was, after all, a single secret way through the locked door, one place in all the universe where we do not merely observe the world from the outside, but feel it from within. And that place is your own body. Consider it, slowly, the way he asks you to. Your body, like everything else, is an appearance,
an object in the world, which you can see and weigh and study from the outside, just as you study a stone or a star. That is your body as representation. But your body is the one object in all the world that you also know from the inside, directly, immediately, without any veil at all. When you will to raise your arm, and your arm rises, there are not two events there. First, a mysterious mental decision, and then, separately, a physical motion linked to it by some chain of cause. There is one event, known in two ways. From the outside, it is a movement of the arm. From the inside, it is an act of will. Your body, Schopenhauer says, is nothing other than your will made visible. Your will become an object, become flesh. The will is the inside of the body. The body is the outside of the will.
And here he takes the great leap, the boldest single stride in all of 19th century philosophy. If my own inner nature, behind the appearance, is will, he reasons, then by analogy I may understand the inner nature of everything. Behind every appearance in the entire world, behind the veil, as the thing in itself that Kant said we could never reach, there is will. Not my will, not your will, not the will of any person, but will itself, one and undivided, the single inner reality of the whole of existence. This is what lay behind Kant's locked door all along. This is the secret name of the thing in itself. But now, feel the terrible difference. Kant had placed behind that door a rational, free, law-giving will, something noble, something that could be the seat of dignity and morality. Schopenhauer reaches through the door and finds something else entirely. He finds a will that is utterly blind, a will with no intellect, no purpose, no goal, no reason whatsoever. It does not will anything in particular. It does not strive toward some destination it hopes to reach and rest in. It simply strives endlessly, mindlessly, without aim and without end. A blind, ceaseless, hungry impulse, an urge that wants only to want, that exists only to keep on willing. He sometimes called it the will to live, the sheer, naked drive to exist, to persist, to push forward, that runs through all things. And once you have seen it, he says, you begin to see it everywhere. The same blind will that pushes your own heart toward what it craves is the force that pulls a stone to the earth, that draws iron to the magnet, that splits a seed and drives the green shoot up through the soil toward the light, that moves the spider to spin and the infant to suckle and the lovers toward each other in the dark. One will, surging up through every grade of nature, from the dull pull of gravity at the bottom to the raging desires of human beings at the top. One single striving, objectifying itself in countless forms, wearing 10,000 masks, but everywhere and always the same. The force that turns the sunflower to follow the sun, and the force that turns your face toward the one you love, are not two forces. They are one, and it is blind. And here is where the great darkness falls across Schopenhauer's world. Here is the heart of what made him the most famous pessimist who ever lived. For if the inner nature of everything is endless willing, then consider what willing is. To will is to want, and to want is to lack, to feel the absence of something, to be in need, to be incomplete. Every desire is born of a deficiency, an emptiness, an ache. And so willing, at its root, is suffering. To exist as will is to suffer, because to exist as will is to be forever in want. And it gets worse, because the relief never comes. Suppose you get the thing you wanted. The desire is satisfied. And what is that satisfaction? It is only the brief removal of a particular pain, the silencing of one ache. It is, Schopenhauer says, purely negative. Nothing positive is added. A torment merely ceases for a moment. And in that moment, before you can even taste any lasting peace, one of two things happens. Either a new desire rises up to take the old one's place, and the wanting begins again. Or, worse, no new desire comes quickly enough, and into the empty space rushes the most desolate revelation of all: boredom. That dreadful, hollow restlessness in which we glimpse the terrible truth that existence, stripped of its wanting, has no content of its own, that we do not know what to do with ourselves, that the bare fact of being alive, with nothing to chase, is unbearable. And so Schopenhauer gives us his most famous and most terrible image. Human life, he says, swings back and forth like a pendulum swings between pain and boredom, and finds no rest at either end. When we want and cannot have, we suffer the pain of lack. When we get what we wanted, the wanting dies, and we sink into the emptiness of boredom until a new want rises to lash us back into pain. Back and forth, pain and boredom, lack and emptiness, our whole lives long. Happiness, on this view, is never a real and positive thing we attain. It is only the brief gap between two sufferings, the momentary absence of pain before the next ache arrives. Pleasure is merely a debt repaid. Pain is the original capital. The wheel of willing turns and grinds us and never stops. This, then, is Schopenhauer's verdict on existence, and he delivered it without flinching. Against the comfortable old idea that we live in the best of all possible worlds, lovingly arranged for our good, he declared the precise opposite, that this is closer to the worst of all possible worlds, a world that could scarcely be worse and still continue to exist at all, a world in which every creature lives by devouring others, in which the whole of nature is one vast field of striving and suffering and death, the blind will forever feeding upon itself, tearing at its own flesh in a banquet that has no host and no purpose and no end. If we stopped here, this would be among the bleakest visions ever set down by a human hand. But we do not stop here, because Schopenhauer, and this is the turn that makes him not merely a pessimist, but a kind of strange, dark physician of the soul, Schopenhauer believed there were ways out of the burning house, not ways to defeat the will or to satisfy it, for it can never be satisfied, but ways to escape it, to slip for a moment or forever out from under the wheel. And he found three. The first is the one nearest to us, the one almost everyone has tasted, even if only for an instant. It is the escape through beauty, through art. Think of what happens, Schopenhauer says, in those rare moments when you stand before something truly beautiful, a great painting, a mountain at dusk, a piece of music, and you become so absorbed in it that you forget yourself entirely. For that moment, you stop wanting. You are not calculating how to use the thing, or possess it, or what it can do for you. You have ceased, for once, to be a creature of desire. You have become, he says, a pure, will-less, painless, timeless eye, a clear mirror in which the world simply contemplates itself. And in that stillness, the wheel of willing stops turning, the torment falls silent. You are, for one blessed instant, released. This is the secret of why beauty brings such peace. It is a holiday from the will, a brief stepping out of the stream of endless wanting into a still pool of pure contemplation. The artist, the genius, is simply the person gifted with an unusual capacity for this will-less seeing, and able to fix what they have seen and hand it to the rest of us, so that we too might rest for a while in their vision. And of all the arts, Schopenhauer singled out one as standing utterly apart, higher and deeper than all the rest: music. For all the other arts, he says, show us the world. They give us images of things, of forms, of the grades of the will's striving. But music does not show us the world at all. Music does not picture anything. Music, he says, is a direct copy of the will itself. It speaks, without passing through the world of images and concepts, the very language of that blind striving that is the inner nature of everything. When you listen to a melody, the way it wanders away from home and yearns and strains and is thwarted and at last returns and resolves. You are hearing, Schopenhauer says, the very motion of willing as such, the heartbeat of the inner world made audible. That is why music moves us so immediately and so unspeakably, why it can reach past every defense and shake us to the depths without saying a single thing we can put into words. Because in music we are not looking at the veil, we are hearing what lies behind it. The second way out runs deeper, and it is the foundation of all that is good in human beings. It begins with a question Schopenhauer thought the whole of ethics turned upon. How is it possible that the suffering of another creature can move me, can reach into me, and grieve me as if it were my own? When I see a stranger in pain or an animal in torment, and something in me aches in answer, and I am moved to help, asking nothing in return, what is happening? Schopenhauer's answer is not Kant's. It is not reason. It is not duty. It is not the moral law. It is compassion, fellow suffering, the immediate, wordless participation in another's pain. And he believed that all true goodness, all genuine love, every act of selfless kindness in the history of the world springs from this single root. But why can we feel it? And here Schopenhauer's pessimism turns, astonishingly, into something like grace. We can feel another's suffering as our own, he says, because beneath the veil of Maya, beneath the illusion of space and time that splits the one will into a million separate selves, we are not separate at all. The will that suffers in you, and the will that suffers in the beggar at your door, and the will that suffers in the wounded animal are one and the same will. The wall between us is the dream curtain, the veil of individuation, and it is not real. The cruel man, the egoist, is simply the one most deeply caught in the illusion, convinced to his bones that he is here and everyone else is merely out there, that his own suffering is real and the rest is shadow. But the compassionate soul has begun, however dimly, to see through the veil, to sense the underlying oneness, to recognize itself in all that lives and suffers. And Schopenhauer reaches once more for the ancient wisdom of India, for the great formula whispered in the Upanishads, 3 small words that he thought contained the whole of morality: tat tivam asi, that art thou. That suffering creature before you, that is you. You are that. There was never anyone else. And the third way out is the highest, and the rarest, and the strangest of all, the one toward which his whole gilded Buddha seemed to point. The man of compassion has pierced the veil a little, but there are a very few, the saints, the mystics, the holy renunciants of every tradition, who pierce it all the way through, who see clearly and finely that all of existence is suffering, that the will is the root of all of it, and who then do the one thing that can truly end the torment. They turn the will against itself. They cease to will, not by destroying themselves, for suicide, Schopenhauer insisted, is no escape at all, but the ultimate affirmation of the will. A creature so in love with willing that it would rather smash the whole game than play it on any terms but its own. No, true release is something quieter and far more total, the gradual, voluntary quieting of the will from within the renunciation of desire, the letting go of all craving, the slow extinguishing of the very flame of wanting that drives the will. And Schopenhauer saw this same achievement, this same blowing out of the flame, behind the saintliness of every age and every faith, in the Christian mystic who has emptied himself, in the Hindu renunciant who has laid down all desire, in the Buddhist monk walking the path toward nirvana, which means, quite literally, a blowing out, an extinguishing, as one snuffs a candle. When the will has at last turned and denied itself, what remains? To us, to those of us still spinning on the wheel, still burning with want, it looks like nothing at all, a terrifying emptiness, a void. But Schopenhauer ends his enormous book on a note of strange and beautiful reversal. To the one who has truly turned, he suggests, it is the other way around. It is this world, this whole roaring world of willing and striving and suffering, this world we cling to so desperately, that is, in the end, nothing. And what the saint has entered is a great calm beyond it, an ocean-like peace, a stillness deeper than all our restless reasoning can reach. The will has gone quiet at last, and there is peace. That was the vision of Arthur Schopenhauer, the bitter, solitary, gold coin-pocketing pessimist, who nonetheless ended in something close to a hymn to the peace that passes understanding. He was the first great philosopher of the West to take the ancient thought of India into the very center of his system, to set the Buddha beside Kant on his shelf, and believe he had given a rigorous Western voice to what the sages of the East had known all along. And though the world ignored him for most of his life, his vision, once it was finally heard, ran like dark water into everything that came after, into the music of Wagner, who read Schopenhauer and was never the same, into the great novels of Tolstoy and Proust and Thomas Mann, into the bare and patient despair of Samuel Beckett, into the dreams of Borges. He became the philosopher of the artists, the one they turned to when they needed words for the suffering and the longing that lay beneath the surface of the world. And among the many who fell under his spell, there was one young man in particular. One afternoon, in a second-hand bookshop in the city of Leipzig, a brilliant and intense young student, 21 years old, already a prodigy, lonely and searching, let his hand fall, almost at random, upon a battered copy of The World as Willed and Representation. He took it home. He read it as though it had been written for him alone. He later said that it was as if the philosopher were speaking directly into his ear of renunciation, of denial, of the suffering at the root of life, and for years afterward he called himself, proudly, a disciple of Schopenhauer. He drank in the whole of it, the blind will beneath the world, the suffering, the redemption through art. His own first great book would be soaked in it. But this young man was not made for discipleship, and as the years passed, something in him began to recoil from the very heart of his master's teaching. He came to look upon Schopenhauer's great longing, the longing to quiet the will, to deny life, to blow out the candle and enter the calm of nirvana. And where Schopenhauer had seen the highest wisdom, the disciple began to see something else. He began to see a sickness, a hatred of life dressed up as holiness, a great weary no spoken against existence itself, a will, yes, even this, but a will turned backward and inward, a will to nothingness. And he resolved to do something audacious beyond anything yet in our story. He would keep his master's one tremendous insight that will is the floor of the world, the bottom of all things, and he would turn its entire meaning upside down. He would take the will that Schopenhauer begged us to escape, and he would teach us instead to bless it. He would answer the deepest no ever spoken in philosophy with the most thunderous yes. His name was Friedrich Nietzsche. But not yet. Rest now. Let the dark waters settle, the blind will surging up through the stone and the seed and the beating heart, the pendulum swinging between wanting and emptiness, and then the three quiet doors out of the fire, the still pool of beauty, the recognition of yourself in all that suffers, and, at the very end, the candle gently going out. Hold none of it too tightly. There is a great calm in it, if you let there be. There is no hurry at all. Breathe slowly. We will go on in a moment. We turn now to the most thunderous voice in the whole of our story, and in the end, the most heartbreaking. Friedrich Nietzsche was born in the year 1844 in a small village in the German countryside, the son of a Lutheran pastor, a gentle, musical man, who died of a softening of the brain when Friedrich was only 4 years old, followed within months by the death of the boy's infant brother. And so Nietzsche, like Schopenhauer before him, was marked early by death and raised thereafter in a quiet household full of women, his mother, his grandmother, his aunts, and the younger sister, Elizabeth, who would one day cast a long and terrible shadow over everything he wrote. We will come to her. The boy was a prodigy of an almost frightening kind. He buried himself in the ancient world, in Greek and Latin, in the study of old texts, the discipline they called philology, and he was so brilliant at it that at the age of just 24, before he had even finished his doctorate, he was offered a full professorship at the University of Basel in Switzerland. It was unheard of. A boy, scarcely more than a student, handed a chair that older scholars labored their whole lives to reach. And it was around this time, you will remember, that he found that battered copy of Schopenhauer in the Leipzig bookshop and gave himself over, body and soul, to the philosophy of the will. And it was around this time, too, that he fell under the spell of a living man who seemed to embody everything Schopenhauer had promised, the composer Richard Wagner. To the young Nietzsche, Wagner was a god walking the earth, the artist who would redeem a hollow modern world through the sheer Dionysian power of music and myth, exactly as Schopenhauer had taught that music alone could speak the language of the inner depths. Nietzsche worshipped him. Wagner, decades older, became something like the father Nietzsche had lost. And out of that devotion came Nietzsche's strange and brilliant first book, soaked through with both Schopenhauer and Wagner, a meditation on Greek tragedy, on the two great forces he named the Apollonian, the principle of beautiful form, of dream, of measured order, and the Dionysian, the principle of intoxication, of ecstatic dissolution, of the terrible, joyful chaos beneath all form. He believed the Greeks had achieved their greatness by looking straight into the horror of existence and then redeeming it through art, by saying, in the teeth of all that suffering, a tremendous yes. But Nietzsche was not built for worship. And slowly, painfully, he turned against Wagner, against Schopenhauer, against nearly everything he had loved. With Wagner, the break was personal and bitter. Nietzsche came to see in the older man's later work, with all its Christian piety and its pageantry, not redemption, but capitulation, not strength, but a kind of theatrical decadence, a kneeling at the cross. The friendship shattered, and the wound never healed. And with Schopenhauer, the break went even deeper, down to the very root of the philosophy of the will. For Nietzsche could not accept where his master had ended. He looked at Schopenhauer's great longing, the longing to quiet the will, to deny life, to renounce all desire and blow out the candle and dissolve into the calm of nirvana, and he asked a dangerous question. He asked, what kind of person needs to believe this? What kind of life speaks this way? And the answer he gave was devastating. He decided that the whole magnificent edifice of Schopenhauer's pessimism, the whole gospel of denial, was not wisdom at all. It was a symptom, the voice of a life grown tired, exhausted, turned against itself, a sickness that had learned to call itself holiness. Schopenhauer had looked at the will, seen suffering, and concluded, therefore, no, refuse it, escape it, extinguish it. And Nietzsche resolved to answer that no with the most resounding yes ever spoken. But to do it, he had to keep the one great insight while overturning everything built upon it. He agreed with Schopenhauer that beneath the surface of things lies will striving, drive, the deep, restless wanting that moves all life. There he stood with his master. But then he asked, What does this will really want? Schopenhauer had said, "It is a will to live, a blind craving merely to exist and persist." Nietzsche said, "No, that is far too thin, too small. Look closely at any living thing," he said, "and you will see that it does not merely want to survive. Survival is only a byproduct. What life wants, down in its depths, is to grow, to expand, to discharge its strength, to overcome resistance, to master and surpass and become more. A creature will risk its very survival for the sake of this. The strong do not cling to mere existence. They spend themselves, they overflow, they impose form on the world and on themselves." And Nietzsche gave this drive its famous and dangerous name. He called it the will to power. Now, you must be very careful here, because few ideas in all of philosophy have been so badly twisted as this one. When Nietzsche speaks of the will to power, he does not mean, first of all, the lust of tyrants, the crude desire to dominate and crush other people. That is its lowest, ugliest, most impoverished form. What he means is something far wider and stranger, the fundamental impulse of all life to grow beyond itself, to become stronger, to give form, to create. The will to power is in the oak driving its roots through stone. It is in the thinker wrestling a vision into shape. It is in the thinker forcing chaos into an idea. And in its very highest form, the form Nietzsche prized above all others, the will to power is turned not outward against others at all, but inward against oneself. It becomes self-overcoming, the long, hard, joyful labor of mastering your own chaos, disciplining your own drives, shaping your own raw nature into something fashioned and free. The person of true power, for Nietzsche, is not the one who commands 1,000 slaves. It is the one who has become the master of themselves. And once he held this key, Nietzsche turned it on the thing he most wanted to understand: our morality. Where did it come from, this entire system of good and evil we inherited and breathe like air and never think to question? He suspected it had a history, and a hidden one, and not a flattering one. And so he became a kind of detective of values, digging down beneath our most sacred moral feelings to uncover their buried origins. He called it a genealogy of morals. And the story he unearthed went something like this. In the ancient world, he claimed, the words good and bad meant something quite different from what they mean to us. To be good simply meant to be noble, strong, powerful, healthy, beautiful, life-affirming, the kind of person who acts and commands and overflows with vitality. The strong looked at themselves and their own flourishing and said, "This is good," and called whatever was low and weak and common merely bad, as an afterthought, with a shrug. This Nietzsche called a master morality, the morality of those who affirm themselves, who say yes to their own strength first, and only then glance down at the rest. But the weak, the oppressed, the ones who suffered under the strong and could not strike back, they were full of a slow, festering, helpless resentment, a poison Nietzsche named with a French word, ressentiment, the impotent rage of those who cannot avenge themselves in deed, and so avenge themselves in imagination, in valuation, in the long memory of the wronged. And these weak ones, Nietzsche says, accomplished the most extraordinary revolt in human history, not a revolt of arms, for they had none, but a revolt of values. Unable to defeat the strong in the world, they defeated them in the realm of good and evil. They performed a great and cunning inversion. They took the strong, the proud, the powerful, the joyful, the self-affirming, and they did not merely call them bad, they called them evil. And they took themselves, the meek, the humble, the suffering, the patient, the self-denying, and crowned themselves good. Weakness became virtue. The inability to strike back became forgiveness. Cowering became humility. Their own impotence, renamed, became the highest morality, and the vitality of the strong became sin. This, this slave revolt in morals, this triumph of ressentiment, is, Nietzsche dares to say, the hidden root of much of the morality we have inherited and revere. A morality born not of strength and abundance, but of weakness and resentment and the longing for revenge. A morality that, at its core, says no to life, to strength, to the body, to joy, to this world, and pins its hopes on a better world beyond. And the strangest twist of all, even the great ascetic ideal, the very renunciation Schopenhauer had praised, the turning away from desire, the mortification of the self, even this, Nietzsche says, is a form of the will to power. It is the will finding no other outlet, turning around and sinking its teeth into its own flesh. The will to power gone inward and sick, but willing still. For the human creature, Nietzsche observed, would rather will nothingness than not will at all. Even in the deepest self-denial, even in the longing for extinction, the will is still there, still straining, only now it has become a will against itself, a will to nothingness. And in that single phrase, Nietzsche pronounced his verdict on his master's whole philosophy. But Nietzsche's diagnosis went further than morality, all the way down to the foundations of the entire Western world, and here he spoke a sentence that has echoed for more than a century, 3 small words that he meant as the most serious announcement a human being could make. God is dead. He did not mean it as a cheap triumph, a clever atheist's boast. He meant it as a catastrophe, an event so vast that hardly anyone had yet noticed it had happened. In one of his most haunting passages, he imagines a madman running into the marketplace at noon with a lantern, crying out that he is looking for God, and the people laugh, and the madman whirls on them and tells them the terrible truth, that we have killed him, all of us, with our science and our doubt and our progress, and that we do not yet comprehend the magnitude of what we have done. For when Nietzsche says God is dead, he means that the entire foundation has fallen out from under us, the whole great structure of meaning and value and purpose that the Western world had rested upon for 2,000 years, the order that told us why we suffer and how we should live and what it all meaning. That foundation is gone, and most people are still walking about as though it were there, living on borrowed meaning, on the warmth of a sun that has already set, and what comes when the foundation is gone. Nietzsche gave it a name, and he saw it coming like a great storm on the horizon of the centuries: nihilism, the dreadful condition in which the highest values lose their value, in which the question why finds no answer, in which nothing means anything anymore, and the human spirit, having killed its God, stands shivering in an empty cosmos with no reason to do anything at all. Nietzsche was not the bringer of this disease. He was its diagnostician, its prophet, and he believed it would be the defining crisis of the age to come, the long shadow of the next 200 years. And in this, it has to be said, he saw further and more clearly than almost anyone of his time. But Nietzsche did not want to leave us shivering. He was, beneath all the hammer blows, a philosopher of the most desperate hope. For if all our old values were created long ago, in the dark, out of weakness and resentment, and then forgotten and mistaken for eternal truths, then they can be created again, by us, differently, out of strength this time, out of abundance, out of a great yes instead of a great no. This was the task he set for the future, not to crawl back to the dead God, which is impossible, nor to sink into the swamp of nihilism, but to pass through it, to become the kind of being who can stand in a universe with no given meaning and create meaning out of their own overflowing strength. He called it the revaluation of all values. and he gave us an image of the one who might accomplish it, a figure he placed in the mouth of a prophet named Zarathustra, whom he sent down from a mountain to teach mankind. The figure he called the Übermensch, a word we might render as the overman, the one who has overcome. And here, once more, you must hold tight against the distortions, because this idea above all has been dragged through the mud. The overman is not a blonde brute, not a master race, not a conqueror trampling the weak. Nietzsche meant something almost the opposite, a future kind of human being who has overcome nihilism and overcome himself, who needs no heaven and no God and no comforting beyond, who is strong enough to look existence full in the face with all its suffering and all its meaninglessness, and to say to it freely, out of his own creative power, yes, and I will give it meaning. The overman is the one who is the meaning of the earth, who creates values the way an artist creates, who has become the author of his own life. Man, says Zarathustra, is something that shall be overcome, a bridge, a rope stretched across an abyss, between the animal we were and the something greater we might yet become. And he described the journey toward this in a parable of 3 transformations of the spirit. First, the spirit becomes a camel, the beast of burden, who kneels down and says, "Load me up," who bears the heavy weight of all the old duties and reverences and thou shalts, carrying them out into the desert. Then, in the lowliest desert, the camel becomes a lion, and the lion's task is to win freedom, to fight the great dragon, whose every scale glitters with the words, "Thou shalt," and to roar against it the sacred no, the no that clears a space, that says, "I will." But, and this is the deep thing, the lion cannot yet create new values. It can only win the freedom for creation. And so, at the last, the lion must become a child. For the child is innocence and forgetting, a new beginning, a wheel rolling out of its own center, a first movement, a sacred yes. Only the child can create, only the one who has become as a child, light and innocent and unburdened, can speak the great new yes to life and bring forth values never seen before. And what is that great yes? Nietzsche gave it its most extreme and most beautiful form in 2 ideas that stand at the very summit of his thought, and that are, when you see them clearly, the exact and total inversion of everything Schopenhauer taught. The first he called the eternal recurrence. He offers it as a thought, a test, the heaviest weight a soul can be asked to bear. Imagine, he says, that one night, in your loneliest loneliness, a demon were to creep up beside you and whisper, "This life that you are living, you must live it again and again and again, an infinite number of times. Every pain and every joy, every thought, every sigh, every unspeakably small and great thing in your life will return to you, all in the same sequence, even this very moment, even this whispering demon, over and over, eternally, with nothing new ever, forever." Now, how would you answer? Would you throw yourself down and gnash your teeth and curse the demon who spoke such a thing? Or is there a way to live? Is there even a single moment you might reach, so full, so golden, so beloved, that you would crave nothing more fervently than this, that it should come again and again, exactly so, for all eternity?
Do you feel what he is doing? Schopenhauer's deepest wish was never to return to escape the wheel of willing, to step off it forever, to dissolve into the peace of not being. And Nietzsche takes that very same wheel, the endless turning,
the eternal repetition of all this striving and suffering. And instead of begging to escape it, he asks whether you can love it, whether you can will it, whether you can become the kind of being who would say to the whole of existence, with every pain folded into it, yes, once more, and again, forever. And that brings us to the last and the most luminous of all his phrases, the one in which the whole long arc of our story turns finally inside out. Two Latin words that Nietzsche called his formula for human greatness: amor fati, the love of fate. Not merely to endure what is necessary, any beast can endure. Not merely to accept your life with a sigh as the price of being alive, but to love it, to want nothing whatsoever to be other than exactly as it is and was and will be, to look back on every wound and every loss and every wrong turn, on all of it, the suffering most of all, and to say, I would not have it otherwise. I would have it again. I bless the whole. To say yes, not to the bright parts only, but to the entire indivisible fabric of a life, because you cannot pull one thread without unraveling the whole, and the whole is what you love. That is the answer Friedrich Nietzsche gave to Arthur Schopenhauer, where the master had stood before existence and pronounced with all his being, no. Nietzsche stood before that same existence, with all its blind willing and all its suffering fully admitted, and pronounced with all his being, yes. The will is not a curse to be escaped. The will is the very pulse of life, and the highest thing a human being can do is to take it up and turn it upon itself, and master it, and create with it, and love the whole turning wheel of fate so fiercely that you would will its eternal return. The deepest no, answered at last by the most thunderous yes. And now I must tell you how it ended, because the ending of Nietzsche's life is one of the most piercing in the whole history of thought, and you should not drift off tonight without it. For the truth is that the man who wrote these hymns to overflowing strength and radiant health was himself, for almost his entire life, desperately ill. He was racked by blinding migraines, by sickness and vomiting that laid him out for days, by eyes so weak he could scarcely read or write. At 34, his health broke so badly that he had to give up his professorship, and from then on, he became a wanderer, a stateless, homeless invalid, drifting between cheap boarding houses in the high, clear air of the Swiss Alps and along the Italian coast, chasing the climates that eased his pain, alone, almost always alone, writing his most exuberant and life-affirming books in solitude and agony between the attacks. The philosopher of the great Yes composed nearly all of it while suffering more than most of us will ever know. There is a kind of unbearable courage in that, when you let yourself feel it, a man teaching the love of fate from inside a fate that gave him so little to love. And then, in the first days of the year 1889, in the city of Turin, something inside him gave way at last. The story that has come down to us, perhaps true, perhaps half legend, is that he was walking through a public square when he saw a coachman savagely beating a horse, and that he ran to the animal and flung his arms around its neck, weeping, to protect it, and then collapsed. Whatever happened in that square, his mind did not return. The most ferocious intellect of the age sank into a darkness from which it never rose. He spent the last 11 years of his life adrift in madness and silence, gentle, mostly, and uncomprehending, cared for first by his mother, and then, after her death, by his sister Elizabeth.
He outlived his own genius by more than a decade, a quiet, broken man who no longer knew what he had written, while outside, slowly, his fame began at last to spread across Europe. He died in the year 1900, on the very threshold of the century his thought would haunt more than any other. And here we must speak, briefly and carefully, of his sister, because there is a wrong to be set right. Elizabeth took control of her brother's manuscripts and his unpublished notes, and she became the keeper of his legacy, the priestess of his archive. But she was a German nationalist and a fierce anti-Semite. She had married a notorious anti-Semite and gone off with him to found a racial colony in Paraguay, and all of this her brother had despised. Nietzsche broke with Wagner partly over anti-Semitism. He broke with Elizabeth's husband over it. He wrote of anti-Semites and nationalists with open contempt and loathing. And yet, after his collapse, it was Elizabeth who edited and arranged his scattered notebook fragments, who shaped and selected and stitched them into a book she presented to the world as his great unfinished masterpiece on the will to power, and who bent the whole of his image toward her own poisonous politics. And so, in the decades that followed, his words could be lifted out, torn from their meaning, and pressed into the service of a nationalism and a racial hatred that the living Nietzsche would have spat upon. The philosopher of self-overcoming, of the love of fate, of the individual soul's lonely labor to create itself, handed over by his own sister to be the mascot of a mob. It is one of the cruelest ironies in the history of ideas, and it is worth carrying with you, that a thinker can be murdered a second time, long after his death, by the hands that claim to honor him.
That was Friedrich Nietzsche, the disciple who turned against his master and answered the great no with the great yes, the prophet who saw the death of God and the coming of nihilism before almost anyone, the sick and solitary man who taught the love of fate and was given a fate almost too heavy to love, and the silent madman whose broken legacy was stolen and defiled. He believed he was the last philosopher, the one who would split history in two, the hinge on which the whole human story would turn. But the will did not stop with him. His shadow falls across the whole of the century that came after his death, and the great conversation we have been following all night, from the marketplace of Athens through Kingsburg and Frankfurt and the high Swiss valleys, does not end at his graveside. It flows onward into new minds and new forms. One man will lay the will down upon a couch and call it the unconscious. Another will read Nietzsche as the very end of all Western philosophy and go looking, against the will, for a way of quiet letting be that strangely echoes both the Buddha and Schopenhauer's blown-out flame. The thinkers of human freedom will seize upon the burden of self-creation and make of it a whole philosophy of existence. And the ancient wisdom of the East, which Schopenhauer first carried westward, will rise to meet all of it, like a face appearing in a mirror. And at the very end, after all the philosophers have had their say, we will come back to where we began, to you, in the dark, with your own small and ordinary will, the thing in you that wanted to listen tonight, and that will want, tomorrow, 1,000 things again. But not yet. Rest now. Let the great yes hang in the air a moment, alongside the great no it answered. The blind will that Schopenhauer begged us to escape, and that Nietzsche begged us to bless. The wheel we long to step off, and the wheel we might learn to love. Hold them both lightly, side by side. You do not have to choose between them tonight. No one is asking you to choose anything at all. There is no hurry. There is all the time in the world. Breathe slowly. We will go on in a moment.